Hi, it's Gary from Alternate History 100. A while back I did a short on the topic of what if Robert F. Kennedy was not assassinated? It was a short because all my research suggested that, had he lived, he could not have won the Democratic nomination in 1968, and that even if he did, he could not have beaten Richard Nixon. His ongoing life was a difference that did not change the course of the 1968 election, and was therefore no good for this channel. But then I got a message from listener Brian in Toronto who asked, what about subsequent elections? And in that I found a way to make the premise work. So here we go. A full episode. Let's call it, What If Robert Kennedy Was Not Assassinated 2. Enjoy.
This is Alternate History 100. Welcome to the class.
Good morning. I want to take you back to the evening of June 4th, 1968. We're in the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles, and Robert Kennedy has just made his triumphant speech after winning the California primary in his quest for the Democratic nomination for the upcoming election. They're sneaking him out through the kitchen when a disgruntled Palestinian named Sirhan steps forward with a pistol in his hand. In our world, that was the end of Kennedy's life. But in this other world I visited, a quick-thinking chef's assistant named Liliana Elena Jimenez Cruz grabbed Sirhan's wrist and spoiled his aim. Shots rang out, one of them killing Kennedy's friend Rayford Johnson. Others rushed in to help Miss Cruz, and Sirhan was wrestled to the floor while Kennedy was hustled off to safety. Headlines around the world the next day said, "Phew." Security tightened around Kennedy and the other candidates as they moved towards that violence-plagued convention in Chicago. Kennedy stood in that arena and gave a speech that some thought would sway the delegates. But it was not to be. The bigwigs in the party favored incumbent Vice President Hubert Humphrey and gave him the nomination, as they did in our world. And just like here, Humphrey went on to lose the election to Richard Nixon. Kennedy returned to his Senate seat and began to plan his future. Nixon had a successful term, where he established the Environmental Protection Agency, opened diplomatic relations with Communist China, nudged North Vietnam towards peace talks, and presided over America's landing on the moon. It did not look like he could be beaten in 1972, so Kennedy kept his powder dry. George McGovern got the Democratic nomination and, as in our world, was beaten in a landslide. And then came Nixon's second term. Creeping inflation, rising unemployment, the resignation of Vice President Spiro Agnew in a scandal of extortion, bribery, and tax evasion. And most of all, Watergate. Nixon resigned and flew off in a helicopter to spend the rest of his life writing books and being an elder statesman. He was succeeded by Gerald Ford, a caretaker who hadn't even been elected as vice president. As the 1976 election approached, there was Republican blood in the water. And Robert Kennedy, like the shark in Jaws, could smell it. Bum, 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 bum. Nothing. Your parents would get that reference. In our world, 17 candidates stepped forward to fight for that nomination. In that world, Kennedy made it 18. The 17 that came forth in our world were senators and governors and even the mayor of Washington, D.C. Accomplished men, to be sure, but if I were to read off their names, I'd wager you wouldn't recognize any of them. And even in 1976, none of them were grabbing everybody's attention. So when Kennedy tossed his hat in the ring, there was real excitement. He roared through the primaries and had the nomination locked up long before the convention at Madison Square Garden in New York. You know, where they have all the boxing matches and hockey games. In the election campaign, he never flip-flopped like Jimmy Carter did in our world, and in November, he handed incumbent Gerald Ford a shellacking. Much was expected as Kennedy took the oath of office. Here was a man who would bring back the good old days of 16 years prior when his brother was sworn in. But that was a false hope. Robert Kennedy had inherited a mess, and the world of 1977 was nothing like 1961. For starters, the economy was in chaos. Inflation was rampant, fueled in part by the end of cheap oil. They called it the energy crisis, and it was touched off by an oil embargo from the Middle East in retaliation for the West's support of Israel during the Yom Kippur War of 1973. Now, in truth, only a small percentage of America's oil came from the Middle East. But there was a shortage all the same. People had to wait in long lines to buy gasoline, and in some places could only buy on certain days based on whether their license number ended in an odd or even digit. In our world, Carter made a long-term plan to wean America off of foreign oil and to build up domestic reserves. Over there, Kennedy took a different approach, requiring domestic producers to immediately alleviate the shortage by increasing their output. This ended the lineups and dropped the price of gas, though critics said that Kennedy had only punted the problem down the road instead of actually dealing with it. And those same critics were not silenced when he also slapped short deadline requirements on domestic auto producers to improve the fuel consumption on the vehicles they manufactured. On the international front, our Jimmy Carter negotiated a treaty that eventually ceded control of the Panama Canal to the Panamanian government, despite initial misgivings. Over there, Kennedy also had misgivings, but he went along for the same reasons Carter did. It took propaganda points away from the Russians. Oh, those Russians. And once again, nothing. Man, my references are falling flat today. The thing to understand in both worlds is that in 1977, the communists were winning the Cold War. Their victory in Vietnam had emboldened other rebels in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. Gerald Ford did little to stop them, and in our world, neither did Jimmy Carter. Kennedy, on the other hand, took a page from his older brother and stood up to them. In our world, Carter suspended aid to Chile, Nicaragua, and El Salvador in reaction to human rights abuses in those nations. Over there, Kennedy cut off only Chile as he watched communist guerrillas imperil the other two. In our world, the communist Sandinistas took power in Nicaragua. In that world, Kennedy's support stopped that from happening, though it condemned the people there to a never-ending civil war. Carter's greatest accomplishment on the international front was the Camp David Accords, which made a peace between Egypt and Israel. Over there, Kennedy did the same thing, and both men were lauded for it. The terrible economy was certainly a factor in Jimmy Carter's downfall, but the stroke that killed him was the Iran hostage crisis. On November 4, 1979, a group of militant Iranian students seized the American embassy in Tehran and held the staff hostage for 444 days. Carter tried to negotiate their release and even sent a rescue mission to try to extract them. But that mission failed and negotiations went nowhere. Iran shrugged and said, "It is not our government. It is students. What can we do?" Feigned helplessness, like the lazy convenience store clerk who doesn't want to get off his stool and help you find the Pepto-Bismol when you've had a late-night study session with some dodgy pizza. Finally. In the 1980 election, Ronald Reagan said that Iran's actions should be taken as an act of war, and that he would do so on his first day in office. It's interesting that the hostages were released on the day he was sworn in. In that world, Kennedy was tougher on Iran. A carrier-based airstrike smashed several Iranian bases on April 24, 1980. This was followed by a terse note delivered via the Swedish embassy reading, "Release our people now." The 53 hostages were put on a plane to Germany soon after and came home to a reception at the White House days later. Kennedy was lauded for his decisive action in most quarters, though once again there were detractors who felt that he had endangered world peace. As the 1980 election approached, Kennedy stood ready to go for a second term. But though he had improved America's standing on the world stage, there was still that lousy economy at home. High unemployment coupled with high inflation. It was called stagflation, and nobody knew what to do about it because all economic theory written up to that time said that it couldn't happen. There is here, it helped bring about a neoconservative wave that brought Margaret Thatcher to power in Britain and Ronald Reagan in America. And that's where I'm going to stop. Your assignment is to write 1,000 words editorial style on one of the following topics. Compare our world with theirs on the Cold War. Did Kennedy's decisive actions help it to end sooner? Compare the two worlds on the issues of energy and ecology. Did Kennedy's punt on the energy crisis have any negative effects down the road? It's been said that Jimmy Carter was too nice a man to be president. Is there any merit to that thought? Do you really need to be a son of a bitch to run the country and the world? And if you think you do, remember that Kennedy, for all his decisiveness, still wound up being a one-term president. I want you to take one lesson from this story. The Kennedy of that world was denied his chance in 1968, but still made a comeback that took him all the way to the top. Remember that the next time you face a setback. Class dismissed. Hi, I'm Gary Wheeler. Alternate History 100 is a labor of love with the twin goals of entertaining you and making you think. If you like what you heard today, please hit the subscribe button, give us a like, and tell your friends about us. Your word of mouth can really help this channel grow.
The preceding was a work of fiction and should not be taken as actual history.